Dear fellow Stoics navigating the digital age, you've stumbled upon a treasure, and I'm not referring to the latest viral video or meme. If you've ever found yourself scrolling through social media, burdened by the demands of today's world, questioning why you can't simply let go, or desiring to care a bit less about every minor detail, you've come to the right place. Centuries before our modern challenges, wise Stoics based their lives on principles that have a remarkable relevance today. Isn't it intriguing that their timeless wisdom can guide us in our smartphone-dominated, caffeine-driven lives? In the next few minutes, you will explore 10 simple yet profoundly transformative Stoic principles that serve as a refreshing antidote to the chaos of the 21st century. And if you want to be the first to uncover more pearls of wisdom like these, go ahead, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and join us on the journey of self-improvement. Now let's start. Dive deeper. 1. Control what you can, release what you can't. Visualize a scenario. It's a rainy Tuesday morning and you've just prepared the perfect cup of tea. However, just as you're about to enjoy it, your cat knocks it over. The old you might have reacted with frustration and blamed various factors. Nevertheless, here's a Stoic perspective. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. As the illustrious Seneca once said, the true source of disturbance is not the spilled tea, but our interpretation of it. What lies within our control are our reactions. So, the next time your Wi-Fi acts up during a critical Zoom call or your pizza arrives cold, take a deep breath. The true source of disturbance is not the cold pizza, but our interpretation of it. 2. Embrace the present moment. In this fast-paced 21st century, notifications constantly demand our attention, and our thoughts race ahead of our internet speed. However, what often eludes us is the gift of the present moment. The Stoics remind us that today, this very moment is a gift. Instead of squandering it by worrying about the past or the future, being present means truly experiencing life. It's about savoring your meals, actively listening to your friends and feeling the wind on your face. 3. Accept change as nature's course. Life is an ever-evolving journey, mirroring the seamless transitions of seasons. Just as nature follows its course, so should we in our lives. Trying to resist this natural flow can be a draining effort. As the philosopher Epictetus wisely pointed out, genuine freedom is found in accepting and embracing change. Instead of battling against life's unexpected detours, recognizing them as integral components of the grand design can lead to a more fulfilling and harmonious existence. In the grand symphony of existence, change is the prevailing melody. It's a reminder that life's beauty lies in its constant evolution. Accepting this truth allows us to dance with the rhythm of existence rather than struggling against it, ultimately leading to a more liberated and contented life. 4. Detach from external validation. In the modern digital age, where social media platforms and online interactions are prevalent, external validation through likes, shares, and comments has become a significant part of our lives. However, Stoic philosophy offers a timeless and invaluable perspective on this issue. The Stoics teach us to shift our focus from the transitory realm of external validation to the profound reservoir of self-validation. They emphasize that self-worth should not be contingent upon the ephemeral approval of strangers on the internet, but should be grounded in the core pillars of our individuality, our personal values, the authenticity of our actions, and the integrity of our character. This Stoic wisdom acts as a shield against the detrimental impacts of public opinion. It encourages us to be the ultimate judges of our self-worth, recognizing that the value we ascribe to ourselves is far more enduring and authentic than the fleeting judgments of others. In the age of digital affirmation, The Stoics remind us that the most reliable source of validation lies within us, empowering us to build a stronger, more resilient sense of self, rooted in our own principles and virtues. 5. Recognize life's natural cycles. Life's intricate tapestry is woven with natural cycles rooted in the universal truth of impermanence. These cycles, found in various philosophical and spiritual traditions, teach us that every experience, whether joyful or sorrowful, has its season. Within the depths of loss, there lies an opportunity for renewal and growth. This perspective invites us to live mindfully, love deeply, and release gracefully, for each ending paves the way for a fresh beginning. Understanding these natural rhythms fosters resilience and hope, reminding us that even in the most challenging moments, rebirth and transformation are possible. Just as nature transitions through seasons, we too can rejuvenate our spirits and uncover new avenues for growth, creativity, and fulfillment, embarking on a journey of self-discovery within the intricate beauty of life's ever-evolving symphony. 6. Seek growth in adversity. Adversity, akin to a soul-strengthening workout, invites us to shift our perspective from "why me" to "what can I learn from this?" Each challenge conceals a valuable lesson, an opportunity for growth, and a chance to fortify our character. By embracing adversity as a catalyst for personal development, we tap into resilience and wisdom, fostering adaptability, creativity, and the courage to face the unknown. This universal truth transcends time and culture, guiding us to view hardships not as burdens, but as stepping stones on the path to self-discovery and transformation. 7. Cultivate inner riches. Cultivating inner riches is a profound endeavor that transcends the mere accumulation of material possessions. For authentic wealth is discerned in the profound contentment of one's soul, the opulence of life's experiences, and the invaluable treasure trove of cherished memories. It's the narratives we weave, the relationships we nurture, and the meaningful moments we collect, not the material possessions we amass, that truly define our wealth and imbue our lives with genuine, enduring value. In recognizing that the richness of our existence extends far beyond the tangible, we discover a boundless reservoir of fulfillment and prosperity that money alone can never provide. 8. Understand and accept fate. Life unfolds as a delicate interplay between our own determined efforts and the intricate design of the universe. Stoicism, an ancient philosophy, offers a unique perspective that urges us to not only accept, but embrace the unforeseen deviations from our meticulously laid plans. Rather than futilely resisting the twists and turns that challenge our expectations, Stoicism teaches us to find wisdom and resilience in adapting to these unexpected outcomes. It reminds us that the most captivating stories in life often emerge from the most unforeseen and challenging circumstances, weaving a narrative of personal growth, endurance, and the triumph of the human spirit. It encourages us to view these expected detours as opportunities for growth, learning, and the cultivation of our inner strength. Thus, in the tapestry of existence, our lives become a testament to our ability to navigate the unpredictable currents of fate with grace and fortitude, ultimately shaping us into individuals of profound depth and resilience. 9. Be of service to others. In a world replete with abundant opportunities to effect meaningful change and make a positive impact, the timeless wisdom of the Stoics resounds with a powerful message. We are all inexorably connected in a profound partnership that transcends individual pursuits. Stoicism, far from being a solitary endeavor of personal growth, is a philosophy that underscores the imperative of uplifting and supporting our wider community. It compels us to recognize that our lives are interwoven with the lives of others. And in extending a helping hand, we not only enrich the existence of those we touch, but also imbue our own lives with a profound sense of purpose and fulfillment. The Stoic ethos underscores that our journey is not solely about individual thriving, it is equally about the noble mission of elevating others along the path. By recognizing our shared humanity and our collective responsibility to foster a better world, we can weave a tapestry of empathy, compassion, and positive change, shaping a brighter future, not just for ourselves, but for all. In this collaborative endeavor, we discover that our personal growth and well-being are inextricably linked to the well-being and advancement of the broader human family, highlighting the enduring relevance of Stoic principles in guiding us toward a more harmonious and compassionate world. 10. Reflect, review, and realign. Regular reflection is a mirror to our souls. It helps us recognize our patterns, adjust our course, and refresh our perspectives. Consider it a periodic system update for your life. Contemplating your actions, learning from mistakes, and celebrating small victories lead to true contentment and peace. These 10 principles are not about being emotionless or detached. They are about fostering resilience, living in the present, and leading a life filled with purpose and depth. As we conclude this enlightening journey through Stoicism, it's evident that these age-old principles seamlessly fit into our modern existence. Some truths are indeed timeless. Now, I challenge you to share in the comments which of these Stoic principles resonated with you the most. Let's kickstart this conversation, learn from one another, and continue this journey of sharing wisdom and personal growth. Before you embark on your journey armed with this Stoic wisdom, I have a small request. If you found any value in this discussion, consider subscribing, giving this video a thumbs up, and ringing that notification bell. Let's continue this journey of self-improvement together. Here's to mastering the art of letting go and living with intention and enthusiasm. Until our next digital rendezvous, keep the flame of curiosity alive and the spirit of Stoicism burning bright.